Hello there. Welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm doing something. I'm going to try to approach an idea that I have, and it's sort of in some way following up on some other videos that I recorded recently, and sort of themes that have been emerging. And one particular thing was that I did a video recently about Mars in Virgo on the South Node squaring Venus. And that video did better with the algorithm than usual. Or for some reason, I wasn't expecting that many people to like it. So I'm not quite sure. I was also sort of I had a certain thing in my state of mind going into that video. And I have to admit that there was a comment there where the commenter misspelled the word ramble. So wait, there's this kind of thing where it's like, I don't know if I really am not motivated to clarify for somebody who's like misspelling the word rambling, but I have to admit, there is something about, people may detect that I'm beating around the bush or I'm avoiding certain things, or I have to admit that basically there was a certain level of anxiety, I think when it comes to certain transits, and if you know how to read the transits and how they affect your chart and stuff like that, I was a little bit, just to put it frankly, I was a little bit concerned or anxious around this transit and the way that it aspects my chart specifically. But what was interesting is that if you saw in the news just recently, Ozzy Osborne died, right? And now Ozzy Osborne, he's not my favorite musician, but I have to admit that when it comes to heavy metal, Black Sabbath are hands down one of the best black. They invented it basically. They're pretty much some of the founding dudes who invented black metal, or not black. No, sorry, the heavy metal, and then Ozzy Osbourne, from an astrological perspective, I'm very Sagittarius and Scorpio, and there's something about this Mars in Virgo, and if you have a lot of mutable placements, there's something about these transits that are just kind of like, it had me a little bit, my attachments and all this kind of stuff, it had me a little bit. There's something nerve-wracking about it for me, and I have to admit, there's some. It's not just that. There's also some. I was kind of also playing off this theme about the doing things on, being hyper focused, doing things on your own in private versus dealing with the outside world and the other people and being perceived by others, or being the risk of being judged, or getting too high and heady and intellectual stuff, and then being judged as pretentious and stuff like that. And I thought there's something, after making those videos, I started watching a bunch of videos from different YouTubers, and I have noticed, for one thing, there has been a conversation about anti-intellectualism going on, and that there's a couple different YouTubers who have made videos about it, and it's one guy in particular I thought did a good job. However, I think he kind of messed up in I think he got it right in one way, but kind of got it wrong in another way. And this one guy made a video basically where he was describing the history of anti-intellectualism and talking about how, if you look at the history of being literate and being a scholar or something like that, it used to be in the Middle Ages that you only had the most privileged elite class of the priests who were literate, educated people, and then the majority of people were like the riffraff, and there's something about the hierarchies of society, and that the intellect. This is kind of where it's coming from. The thing is, I think that there's this problem in there, in that this guy tended to go in this direction that was very, using this kind of thing having a direction that's progressive in a way that's very anti-religious, right? And that there's a certain fault line or contention here between people who would be it's not, there's also a thing about Christian apologetics, which is to not be completely you're kind of apologizing for the faults of the church and stuff like that. You're not trying to claim that they're somehow perfect, but they're saying that they're still, anyways, regardless, this is kind of where it comes from, right? There's this that maybe this is a bit of a distraction. There's some other videos I was watching about it as well. I found a channel that's kind of like a young African-American woman doing some Afro-punk stuff called Unpoetic Justice. And I think this channel had come up before and I didn't really watch very much of it. And I started watching this, and there's something about this is also, it's a bit, maybe there's a bit different because I'm a millennial, and a lot of this I think has to do with the generation gap, but there's certain issues that I have been thinking about addressing, but then deciding not to, because, and it basically, just to be upfront, all of this has to do with the fact that my mother and sister growing up were really into Harry Potter, but they're also very progressive people, and they had to deal with that whole thing about J.K. Rowling being very against trans people, and it's a touchy subject, basically, right? And so I don't really feel like this. I don't really feel comfortable going into that. But then the thing is that my own self-censorship around that has more to do with the, like, what if I say something that really upsets my family members, and then my personal life is difficult because of something I said on the internet or something like that. It doesn't have, and this is kind of my own baggage of like, well, that maybe if I was more independent, I wasn't so, I wasn't stuck living with my family, and I had to like feel like all these issues become minefields because but then this connects to other issues, like why the hell is housing so expensive? Why the hell, there's this common thing where everybody's just got this landlord, like there's rental, you either live with your family or you're getting the landlord's sucking you dry kind of thing, right? Like there's I don't know. It's a complicated situation, right? But there's some basic issue here where she used this really specific, in her video, she used the very, very hyper-specific problem of JK imagine being a young Zoomer growing up, and you're learning about, you have progressive values, and you're learning about the world, and you're getting into like music and bands and stuff like that, and you're not familiar with what a TERF is. You're not familiar with the J.K. Rowling controversy. You're not familiar with how the TERF thing plays, because this is the whole thing, is that like there's something about what they're talking about, like the cultural capital of the value of the person who's experienced the scene, who knows what it, like is it worth anything to say that, like, yeah, I went to all sorts of all ages punk shows and hardcore shows and indie shows, and there's tons of queer kids, and eventually they all went trans, and eventually you couldn't go to a show without there's a poster that said no TERFs. TERF behavior will get you kicked out of the venue and stuff like that. And like, there's this kind of thing where it's like the having this situation where you're trying to, there's all this social pressure because there's all these like people who are like arty and cool or in band. There's always this pressure that you're going to impress people, make friends with the right crowd, make the right associations. But then if you're like, say the right thing or the wrong thing, like if you like, you're like, oh, this is my friend, a trans person. And then you slip and use the wrong pronouns. It's like, oh my God, get this person, this guy's out of here. Right. You're like, it's like, you're going to have a fucking heart attack. Right. Like, it's like, the whole point is that like, then there's this other side to it. There's this other side to it too, where in interactions, real life interactions with people who are trans or transitioning, there's this whole kind of cultural issue around the history of intellectualism, and is it worth it going back to like continental philosophy, going back to all the old literature, or is this a bunch of like old white man patriarchy shit that we need to throw out, right? And there's like, I had this it's a very like classic scene of like going into a bookstore and like going all these books, and I was hanging out with this girl that I was dating or whatever at the time, and she's like, oh, this is my friend, and it's like somebody who is like a musician who is in the process of transitioning, but like they were more trans, like maybe a bit down the line, and they're like, like, I mean, I'm kind of just curious about looking around for books to read, but I'm just disappointed because it's all just a bunch of like white patriarch, settler, colonialist bullshit, and I think we just need to burn it all down. And there's people that are just like really extreme in that direction, and there's people that are really against that and wanting to preserve there is actually some reason worth reading into for some like I had this thing where I'm completely don't have a problem with trans people, and I completely support I completely support all different expressions of queerness and gender nonconformity and experimenting with what that means in your life. But then at the same time, there's like I have some temptation to read the German philosophers and all this kind of stuff. And there's this problem of does reading the German philosophy, well, some people have already solved this problem, and there's basically this line from Nietzsche to Deleuze, or the post-Nietzschean direction, which easily adapts itself to be in favor of trans people. The people have already, this is a well-trodden path, right? Maybe this is a distraction, but it's a complicated issue, and you can imagine that if you're a Zoomer and you don't even know who J.K. Rowling, you don't know what a TERF is, or that J.K. Rowling's a TERF, or all the problems around this. I mean, I've the generation that had to live with being a child and having your parents read Harry Potter out loud and being like, all right, everybody, let's get into really a Harry Potter time. And then being all kind of like, for some reason, I just feel inclined, there's this problem about consumer society, mass consumer consumption, building an identity around these things that are like brands that you like and you don't like, and that you cannot criticize they're the sibling thing where you like this, I like this, everybody's allowed to like what they like, and you're not, don't criticize it because it'll hurt my feelings or something. And like this is kind of like when there is actually, when you start to be like, well, wait a minute, what are your values? What are your principles? And does it matter can you separate the art from the artist and still enjoy Harry Potter if it turns out this was made by a person who has really different when it comes to you in your social group, the friends you hang out with, what their values are, and what this person who made this media's values are, they seem to diverge in totally different directions, and like it's a contentious issue, right? And you can see why there's these fault lines here, and there's something about what the problem about cringe. Or there's also two things, cringe and intellectualism, right? The thing about cringe is that if you are a young person who's just figuring things out and you don't know the history about all these problems, and you just like, it's not cringe in like you're such a lame person because you just don't get it. It's cringe in that like there's a minefield and people are like, oh no, I hope this person doesn't walk into the minefield and set off the mine, right? It's not cringe because like it's cringe because I'm so embarrassed for that person because they're such an idiot. It's kind of like we hope that this person isn't going to like walk into the crossfire of all these problems and set it off in a bad way, because I've had to deal with this minefield myself and I know what the territory is like. And like, no, don't look out, don't say the wrong thing to the people who hate TERFs, or what, you're trying to like, that's what makes it cringe, right? But the thing is, we live in this sort of like this moment of like complexity where there's like so many complicated dynamics around that it's sort of unreasonable to expect people who are young, who are just figuring this out, to somehow just know about all the intricacies of these problems right off the bat, right? And similarly, what I'm realizing is that I think a lot of this had to do with post-pandemic life, and part of the problem was that the music scene kind of went to shit after the pandemic. A lot of venues closed. A lot of people, conditions were not helpful for live music, and that's something that I really like to do. And in that post-pandemic world, it seemed like a good opportunity to just read more books and to do book, like, it's almost like a meme, the whole like post-pandemic book club thing, right? Now, leading into this, so in this whole transition moment where there's certain, like, it's also, there's something about the whole thing about like wearing band t-shirts and being into punk rock or whatever seems to be sort of like adolescent coded in the way that a lot of people's favorite bands are always the ones that when they were teenagers, and that there's a certain kind of like you have this imprint of like, I'm 17 and I'm going out to punk rock shows and I'm having this big like intense experience of like, you know, like loud music, and we're also it's fun doing, you know, being with people who are making their own culture. It's not just a big stadium thing or whatever, right? But there's like this whole issue about the adolescentness of this, and then trying to expand your horizons, and then you're expanding into territories that you're not like. I ended up taking some courses from Weird Studies that basically open the gateway door. There's all this stuff that I'm just basically not familiar with, and having this thing about like, from my point of view, if there are like young Zoomers who are getting into bands and getting into the punk scene or something like that for the first time, or like that's something that is like, you know, from my perspective, I'm looking, you know, you have all these, you know, you look back 15, 20 years ago or whatever it is, all the versus like things that I'm really not that familiar with, and I'm just getting in, and there'd be this kind of like naivety of like, I don't know any better, and like I don't necessarily know where the fault lines are. I don't really know what the social codes are. I don't know. Or there's also this whole thing. What I've realized is that a lot of the time when it comes to like there's this sort of game, it's like a social game about knowing like what appeals to people, what kinds of, like if you use certain references, what kind of, like, you know, it's kind of funny because when you break it down, it sounds often a lot like the classic Y2K era millennial game, The Sims, right? In The Sims, there are these, when you have social interactions with The Sims, they just go blah, 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 talking sim talk, but they have this like, you know, you get a plus or a minus, and it's basically, at some basic level, it's like, oh, do you like this band? Yes, I like this band. Or like, do you like this reference of like, if you're talking about like, you know, philosophers, who's in, who's out, what's good, what's bad. And the thing is, there's not really a set pattern to this. You're dealing with specific individuals who, when it comes to certain topics, they either go this direction or go that direction, and they favor this guy or they favor this guy, that guy, or something like that. And there's something about when it comes, okay, I might as well. When it comes to like Deleuze and Guattari or whatever, what I've noticed is that there's often this sort of attitude that like, it's like Deleuze is a respectable philosopher, and Guattari is just some like punk ass neo-Marxist rabble rouser who is just a bad influence. And so like to be a Deleuze, like there's this whole thing where we're gonna be like Deleuze is in, Guattari is out. And then so if you go to the guy who has that opinion and you start like trying to talk Guattari, it's cringe because you don't understand the social context, that you're like, oh, you're so, like Guattari is supposed to be the bad one, and you're saying that you're trying to bring Guattari up to the guy who's willing to Deleuze but doesn't like Guattari, or you're trying to like, the people are trying to like, there's this whole coding where it's like, okay, Deleuze and Guattari are good, but anti-psychiatry is like some sort of like, I don't know, it makes you a Scientologist, or that you don't like, you don't want to like say romanticize mental illness. And then if you don't understand that and you do that, then you're cringe because you don't know any, like there's all these guys, there's a million different landmines that you can set off and make and be cringe. And I have to admit that, well, okay, there's all those kinds of problems, right? And a certain naivety of just going into that without knowing any better, right? And what I'm doing, this may seem like a big distraction from the fact of doing an astrology channel, but this could be part of the point. What I'm trying to say is, in this era, post-pandemic, I was involved in book clubs for a while, and in the book club, I was introduced to Eugene Thacker. And then I tried in my astrology channel to just reference some of the Eugene Thacker stuff I was reading. And I don't know, like maybe that was cringe because perhaps I could be like, I think that I kind of made the mistake of just like getting into stuff that I'm new to, that I'm not aware of what is coded which way or that way, and just being like, well, this is cool, I'm going to read some of this. And then there's something I was trying to interpret, why did this flop so badly? Why was this such a mistake? And I was just considering that in my, like, maybe it's because the positive negative thing, or like there's some kind of positivity bias of like people trying to make their astrology really positive. Like there's this whole like, you know, Miss Cleo or there's this whole like, you know, the TV psychic who's just gonna like, or you're gonna give horoscopes where you tell everybody really positive stuff, and this is like some negatives. Oh, anyways, based on, I don't know if that was it, you know, or if it is it like, it could be because from a certain intellectual philosophical thing, astrology is just coded as being ridiculous and that people don't take astrology seriously. But that wouldn't be, is that everybody? And then there's this kind of issue about like, if you could get into the, you know, the appeal to astrology going the way of Platonic idealism. You could go say that Carl Jung was a practicing astrologer, and he was also a philosopher, and he was also a Platonic idealist. And then you could build your whole thing very comfortably in this Jungian idealist Platonic framework and not mess around with anything else. And it's complicated by the fact that I like Deleuze and Guattari. It's complicated by the fact that I took these courses in which the guy teaching the course debated Bernardo Kastrup, the famous idealist guy, arguing against him. And I actually tend to favor this guy G.F. Martel's take better. And then there's this question that I don't understand about like what. So we're for some reason there's this question. I'm starting to realize that. I'm just spilling the beans here, that there's some issue about when you're a writer and when your work is very heavy upon drawing on references to other material. How do you make the decision of what references to include versus what references not to include or hide? And I was listening to a conversation with, I can't remember, I don't know if I'm getting his name, but Jason Bobek I can't remember his last name. And there was something where apparently this guy is a friend of Eugene Thacker, and he was saying in regards to the Acid Horizon guys who made this t-shirt that there was they've been getting too in the weeds here, but there's some specific thing here where he was saying that like Deleuze never mentions Bataille. Right? And then I was in another Deleuze channel. They were talking about how Deleuze was really influenced by this guy named Ruyer. Or Ruyer, am I getting his name right? Apparently there's all these people that are in the background that influenced Deleuze, but Deleuze never mentions. Or Deleuze is very specific. And it's also kind of interesting that Deleuze does, in 1,000 Plateaus, they spend all this time talking about Paul Virilio. So it's like, why does Paul Virilio get the thumbs up? They're like, okay, we're gonna like spend a whole chapter just talking about this contemporary of ours, Paul Virilio, but there may be all these other guys doing stuff that they're just not gonna talk about, right? And so there's this, and then this kind of thing was like, so why is it that there's something about Eugene Thacker? What makes Eugene Thacker famous was that he was everybody likes this TV show True Detective, the first season, right? And that there are bits of True Detective that were basically feel like they're lifted almost straight from Eugene Thacker, right? And so we ended up doing some Eugene Thacker because of the theme of the weird studies and the aesthetic, and everybody likes the True Detective thing or whatever, right? And there's something about like going in that direction, right? And then after that, we did the same person who recommended a book called Creaturely Love. And this maybe This is another issue that maybe would be something for a different video, but there's something about the problem of like transhumanism, and the conversation that happens around transhumanism is very narrowly focused in this direction of being like, we're going to put our brain onto a hard drive and ascend our human body and become cyborg people, or like live forever and then become, or ascend, go into outer space in a rocket ship. It's not about like, it's a conversation that doesn't talk about a kind of transhumanism that's probably been around since prehistory. When you go back to cave paintings and you see the buffalo and the bite, and it's like the man, the man's relation to the non-human in the form of the animal. Right? There's this whole other conversation about transhumanism that nobody talks about. And I'm just like, why? Like, I get that that people want to be like, oh, Peter Thiel and Palantir and all these other things, right? But it's like, why, within our rhetoric, why are we getting hung up by calling that transhumanism and using transhumanism as shorthand for this one thing that is obviously part of it, but there's all these other parts of transhumanism that are left out of the conversation, right? And there's something about that whole conversation that kind of leads to this Dominic Pettman book. And then, so this is the kind of thing in the book club, and we do in succession Eugene Thacker and Dominic Pettman, and then out of all this comes this book, the Sad Planets book, which is like, I have to admit, like, I'm just like, there's also the thing about Dominic Pettman was talking about this quality of openness. And I don't know if I was like this question of like, how much do I censor myself? How much do I constrain myself? And it's like, how much am I, me, the person who is making this video, somehow a implicit influence on the construction of this book? But then it's also interesting because then I get this kind of like, it's as an alternative to social media and using Twitter to talk to these people. It's like, I could just like make, astrology vlogs, and then I could just buy books. And then instead of like going on the internet, I could just like it feels like these guys are writing this book as a response to me or something by bringing them up in my videos as like little references of like just books that I was reading or something. So it's like, and then there's part of this, this is actually, in some way, I figured I would bring this. This is what I'm trying to say, is that what I'm doing, should I, in my private practice, just be very private and discreet about this, or to what extent are you extroverted and public and putting it all out there or whatever? And then in all of this, there is the question, the other question, which is this philosophical thing. And I realize there's certain, like, I just like reading philosophy because, well, there's one thing. Well, I like reading philosophy because I'm curious about it. Another thing is that, and also in the post-pandemic era, it's just sort of, it seems like the circumstances are such that it lends itself better to doing philosophy, to reading books and doing book clubs than living like I'm a 15-year-old going to punk rock shows or something. It's just like, just based on what's going on, this seems to be more of what's going on these days, right? But there's this, other than that, there's this whole problem of at some point in time, I have a history with mental health, anti-psychiatry, stuff like that, and I am honestly, I tend to I like Felix Guattari because I like his anti-psychiatry stuff, and I've noticed there are other people creating Felix Guattari material who've also had history of psychosis or mania and who like Guattari for this reason, right? But in my own case, if there's some kind of issue when it comes to philosophy, and when it comes to that, my issues with mental health is that at some point in time, I just sort of felt like in terms of I solved I solved the problem years ago, or in the sense that I don't take psych meds, and I'm a kind of one of these psych med free anti-psychiatry people, and I don't really involve myself in that scene very much anymore, because I do know some people online who do things like, it's like, I know you may like do it as like a course. You could be like, I will do a workshop where I will talk to all these people who are upset about being on meds, and I will try to give them tips and ideas and how they could, like, you know, reduce off their medication and all this, and free themselves from the tyranny of the mental health system and all this. I just, you know, personally, I'm more inclined to just like not burden myself with that problem and read philosophy books and try to do something else instead. But I mean, there's some kind of issue about, I'm starting to realize that I also just don't want to make content online from the position of like, here is how to cope with X, Y, and Z diagnosis. When I see that kind of content come up online, I was actually watching a video like this, but I decided there's something about it. It's like, there's something, if you are making a video that you're like, I'm going to record a video and this is like manic person in psychosis on camera, you know, blah, blah, blah. It's like, it doesn't seem a little bit self-exploitative, basically, right? And this again leads into why I ended up, there's also Byung Chul Han. Why the whole thing about like, is you making a spectacle of yourself online a act of self-exploitation? But then that whole question, even when as I try to make this video, is, am I making an ass out of myself, making a spectacle out of myself, self-exploiting myself at my own disadvantage? Or am I actually going to be contributing something worthwhile of value? I don't know. But there's some, like, okay, maybe I'm getting distracted here, but the point is that there is this whole philosophical thing that I'm doing kind of on the side. And I think that I'm kind of trying to navigate this issue of, is it better to combine that philosophical thing with my astrology videos, or is it better to separate that and just focus on the astrology? But then the thing is, it's like, I'm not, the funny thing about the philosophy thing is that, is it like, are you going to apply that to what? Are you going to apply that, you know, the philosophy is more interesting when you have a reason why you're interested in it, right? And what's interesting about Deleuze and Guattari is that it's actually useful and helpful for understanding things like mania, psychosis, or even autism, I guess. Like, I think there's probably a lot of people who, if I see people complaining about things that they describe as autism, and that if you have the time to actually put the effort in to try to understand 1,000 plateaus, and then you apply that to your problem with autism, you may have a different insight into it, right? And I don't know if it's really my job to spell that out for you about what kind of different insight you would have. But the fact that you don't have the effort, or you can't sustain the capacity of attention to read a really dense, complicated book and figure it out, puts you at a kind of there's a certain thing where you're like, you're not going to do that, you know? No, and if the people who are going to do that are going to do that. Maybe this isn't a good one. I'm recording it anyways. I'm not going to edit it. I'm just going to throw it all together. The point is that there's some kind of I'm not trying to do anything. I've decided that I've achieved my victory over the psych system in the fact that I can talk about stuff openly. I can record videos. I can talk about my situation. I can say, hey, my name is Dan. I was a person who was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder in 2012, and then I have been living free from all psychiatric medications since 2016. And there are other medications I have to take for other problems, but I get to live without medication, and my brain works better without medication, and it's my free choice that I choose to do that, right? And there's something about this that when it comes to using philosophy, there's certain epistemological questions that has to do with, if you accuse me of having a mental illness, what is your basis for making that claim, right? Do you have any, there is no objective biomarker. You can't take a blood test. You can't do a brain scan. And there's all these things you cannot do with a schizoaffective diagnosis that you could. But the thing is, if you had dementia, there are all sorts of clearly evident signs of dementia that if you may have demyelination or something like this. There are all sorts of very tangible, objective brain problems that a person can have, but trying to interpret schizophrenia or schizoaffective in terms of objective brain health, brain science, is something that you can't do. So it's like you create a category that has no objective basis based on the interpretation of behavior, which is itself socially contingent upon the complicated social dynamic of the situation you find yourself in, right? There's this kind of thing, though, that it's like, what I find, though, is that when you start dealing with people who are educated, it's not really hard to convince them of this problem, because it's a different social context than dealing with a bunch of psychiatrists or a bunch of stubborn medical professionals who have this is the way we do things, this is the protocol, it's like robot people, right? And if you get you get your ass out of that situation, you don't have to, you realize it's a waste of energy trying to create an intellectual philosophy to deal with that problem, right? And then outside of that, there's like a certain avenue by which to explain astrology in a way that isn't Platonic idealism. And this is actually perhaps kind of controversial in the sense that what I've noticed is that even people who seem categorized as Deleuzo-Guattarians tend to still just fall into this weird Marxist thing about making it about this binary between materialism versus idealism, and then arguing for the side of materialism. And this is a very, I don't know, is this Hegelian? Is this the Zizekian Hegelian shit? The whole thing is that there's a way that you can just get out of the whole materialist, idealist fuck around and not make your philosophy you can still do astrology too, right? That's the best part. You don't have to be an idealist, you don't have to be a materialist, and you can still have your archetypes, you can still have your astrology, you can still have your I Ching, you can still have your divination, and it still works. That's the best part. It's actually like, you don't ever mind, So I mean, I don't know if the whole point is that like the main issue is like is there a point in trying to make an intellectual argument for how and why astrology works, or trying to prove, making argument for like, this is going to be the status quo has to adopt astrology? No, I don't want to do that. I think that's kind of stupid. But I do believe that astrology is real and it works, right? I do believe that. I'm not interested in trying to turn that into a debate topic. And there's this question of like, what's the point of getting onto this philosophy anyways, right? Because I've solved the one thing, the diagnostic problem is fairly easy. You don't really need that much philosophy. Second of all, I don't really need to use it to argue. I'm not going to try to argue that astrology is right or something like that, or real, but I mean, I don't think I really need to do that. But there's something interesting anyways about understanding the nuts and bolts of the argument and understanding the landscape, the general landscape. For example, in this book, they talk about Hegel and about how the way that Hegel apparently had a very disparaging attitude towards stargazing, that Hegel thought the stars were like a eruption of the sky had a skin rash, like a bunch of blemishes. There was no divine beauty. It was just a bunch of like randomly scattered pimples on the sky or something. And then there's this kind of like, you could see that if Hegel thought that about astrology, no wonder Zizek, the Hegelian, has such this disparaging attitude towards mysticism and being a wise guy, all this kind of stuff, right? And so there's this guy, I do kind of like Hegel, or not Hegel, but I do like Zizek. I have to also admit that when I was in Australia, I knew a guy who was reading Hegel, and he was a very interesting character. He was the kind of guy who, despite the fact that Melbourne, Australia, is kind of has this. Melbourne in Australia is the hipster capital of Australia. There's more hipster concentration in Melbourne probably than any other part of Australia. And so me as at least, I don't know if I was much of a hipster, but aspiring wannabe hipster, hanging out in the hippest neighborhoods of Melbourne, you encounter people in those circumstances that resisted the hipster paradigm of working in you're going to get a job as a barista in a fancy cafe and do latte art. This guy instead chose to go the other direction, and he decided to get coffee from 7-Eleven, right? And he would just drink the shittiest 7-Eleven coffee and say, fuck the hipsters, man. This is really where it's at. It's like, but you have to enjoy this sort of jouissance of it's a perversion. You enjoy the shitty 7-Eleven coffee like a pervert, basically. You go to the grimiest, dirtiest gas station coffee and be like, screw the hipsters, right? And this guy is, I think, a kind of a Hegelian visionary of the resistance against progressivism, basically, right? But ironically, this guy ended up becoming a left-wing politician. So, but he was a left-wing. This guy's a leftist Hegelian, right? I didn't really understand Hegel at the time, but based on this guy's attitude, it helped to inform me in my philosophy. So I'm basically, I'm just trying to give you an update of where I'm at with this. Basically, I am a anti-Hegelian. I'm not a materialist or an idealist. And the thing is, Nietzsche wasn't a nihilist. Nietzsche was trying to solve the problem of nihilism. And I'm not an existentialist, because an existentialist would suggest that there is no inherent meaning to the cosmos aside from your little project to produce it, right? Which is maybe partially true, because I do think that astrology to some extent is a creation, a production, but then there is maybe there's an inherent order that is there regardless that makes it all work. And that, I don't know, there's something about this problem of, I think there's some kind of, there's this problem I find though of doing it. There's of reading philosophy on one hand and then doing it at the same time while trying to be an astrologer, that there's a certain friction that's there. And what I'm trying to say is that there's some kind of thing about trying to deal with the cringe of it that comes from the fact that there's probably a lot of people who have been doing philosophy for a lot longer than me. And I think there's also the cringe thing that if you wanted to get taken seriously in academia, you probably wouldn't want to just create a public profile for yourself as an astrologer. And I also, I think there's all this, astrology has all this baggage that I'm often maybe I should try to produce a new identity that's not associated with astrology, so that if I wanted to comment and reply on different videos, I could give an opinion and not have to carry the baggage around of being an astrologer, and I could just be somebody who has opinions and talks but engages in a discourse about things. But then there's this kind of where you start to look at what that is like online and what direction that has gone and who the people are that are considered to be debate bros. At least to get to their own credit, I think they at least, if you listen to these guys who are debate bros talk, they're at least honest about the fact that most of the time they're engaging in sophistry. They're not really doing really hard philosophical arguments. They're just trying to you're going to try to say something that sounds eloquent, that people are going to find interesting, that is sort of entertaining to listen to. But whether you're right or wrong, or your point is off, nobody actually really cares. It's sophistry, man. You're going to have to say some words that sound good and get people to sort of be agreeable. And you did a good job, right? If you come out if you're right, but you're running head first into the minefield and the fault lines. It's cringe. And if you're cringe, it doesn't matter if you're right. You're just being embarrassing. And you know, I don't know. I don't know if I'm getting it or not. I'm just kind of playing with it. But so this is a kind of like an update on the there's this whole issue here also about there's this underlying thing too about True Detective, and this whole thing about cosmic sadness, cosmic nihilism, cosmic pessimism, all this kind of stuff. And in this book, they're talking a lot about the planet Saturn and how Saturn kind of represented this. And so, you know, it could be good reading they do a good kind of balance in the fact that they are kind of admitting that they are not they don't sound like people who believe in astrology, but they can go back to Ficino. They can talk about a lot of mystics, but Thacker seems to take a very pessimistic, skeptical kind of position. And it's also interesting. I guess I should also say that while I'm on this sort of thread, there is also this funny issue about the Dark Enlightenment, which by no means do I subscribe to people like Curtis Yarvin. I wouldn't want to be on like the same team as like Nick Land, but I do find Nick Land sort of interesting to listen to, even though I don't agree with him. And I think it's at least to his credit that as somebody who has a bad reputation, that he can present himself in such a way that it's like at least tolerable and palatable to listen to, as opposed to like there's some people that are just completely like I couldn't even stand to listen to them. But there's somebody who's able to at least present themselves in such a way that even if you don't want to be on his team, it's not just like you can still be like, oh, I guess that was sort of worthwhile listening to him. But there's something about, anyways, regardless, I don't agree with him. One of the things I don't agree with is that in a recent Nick Land conversation, he was trying to in this question about Baudrillard, he was trying to go this direction of saying that like it's simulation all the way down, basically, right? Which is like saying it's Maya all the way down, it's illusion all the way down. This is a kind of like the problem, this certain fault line that gets a bad reputation and this Curtis Yarvin, who I also wouldn't align myself with. Curtis Yarvin was recently in some big public interview with, what is it, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or what was it? But he said this thing about what characterized this sort of intellectual movement that was influencing Doge and Elon Musk and Donald Trump was not so much what people believed in, but an absence of belief, basically nihilism, basically an absence of belief, an absence of values, an absence of morals, and this sort of the raw force of power and capitalism and all this. And this is sort of like why there's a split anyways, where JF Martel goes in this other direction that is more affirming of, I mean, he's a Christian though, right? And then you get this whole thing about the Christian accelerationists who feel that the moral crisis that is created out of all the chaos and problems in the world is going to basically renew the moral center which is obviously in complete decomposition if you look at the fundamentalists. Or the fact that the fundamentalists right have aligned themselves with Donald Trump the pointing out that the hypocrisy is kind of redundant at this point, right? It's kind of like the time for pointing out things like this being hypocritical was over a long time ago. It's past the point of that into a state of bizarre decomposition where it's like nobody's going to take that stuff seriously at face value, right? And so there is, but there's this kind of cynicism. That's like, this is the kind of thing of being all like voting for the party that all the right-wing fundamentalists agree with, out of a cynical attitude, because yeah, I know they're full of shit, and I'm a resentful, nihilistic, cynical bastard, and I'm going to vote MAGA too, not because I believe in Jesus, not because I believe in God, not because I believe in goodness or moral virtue, because I don't believe in those things, and I'm just a bad person, and I'm going to vote for the bad person because I'm evil, right? And this is like, or that it's just, oh, it's nothing, there's no truth, nothing means anything, like, and I'm just an edgelord, right? It's not, that's not, I'm a Canadian, and I vote for the NDP, and I do actually believe in progressive things, and I do believe I take the opposite approach, right? And so that's this is to be more just transparent, I guess, about what my position is. This is the direction that I go in, and I do realize that what's interesting about listening to popular astrologers is that popular astrologers bring up the topic of the Dark Enlightenment, people like Yarvin and Land, in relation to Pluto and Aquarius and Uranus and Gemini, and talk about this like, like, what is it? This techno singularity, all these kinds of things with the techno age of Aquarius. And this idea is getting broadcasted out to a whole bunch of people who may not really be maybe kind of naive to what it's about. But the funny thing is, it's actually like, if you do listen to Nick Land, he's actually more optimistic than an extremely cynical, like, doomer attitude. Like Nick, like this is the problem, was that at some point in time, there's a guy that I hung out with who was diagnosed schizophrenic, and he would often go into this, we talk about stuff, and he'd often go in this direction of like AI doomerism, basically Terminator 2, or like the whole, and there's something about, if you actually listen to Nick Land is more optimistic than that, in that he thinks this is entirely, it's a very unimaginative, I mean, because you'd be basically a whole generation of kids who grew up with Terminator 2, just regurgitating the plot line from that movie in a paranoid state. And it's like, the people who are actually the thinkers in this movement that gets called the Dark Enlightenment are like, that's like, you think like, they're like, this is kind of a lack of imagination. You really think that this is the best we can do as humanity? That we're just going to like invent an AI that's just going to wipe us out, and then, oh, no more humanity. Like they're like, can't we do better than that? Like, or like, why, or there's this kind of like, I've heard this other argument that basically the AI tech bros fear what AI might become because they're so narcissistically absorbed in their own mentality that their own mentality is to just make as much money as possible and destroy the planet. And they are afraid that if they can't imagine designing intelligence that would operate in a different way. So they basically assume that what they're going to build is going to mirror their own worst qualities back to them. And rather than them, but they're too attached to being that way to change. So they're just like, this is very Pluto Aquarius. When you realize that there's a problem with what you're doing, but you are too fixed in your ways to change and adapt so that you do things better. But you're just going to go like play chicken, where you're just going to go in a straight line and head towards this. Oh my God, it's going to be the end of the world because we can't do anything but like build a million nuclear reactors and like build AI that like we need to consume all of Earth's resource, and then we're going to send a rocket to Mars, and we have to do it faster. Like this is like, yeah. It doesn't help that Nick Land acceleration shit. I'm not on board with that, right? Maybe decelerate. Maybe I think, and then maybe this is a good time to introduce. Some people talk about solar punk, but have you heard about salvage punk? There's a movement that hasn't gotten the same mimetic catch value yet. Salvage punk goes all the way back to what people I've hung out with when I used to live in the city. When you lived in the city, it's common to have all kinds of these, you're salvaging bike parts, you're trying to teach people bike mechanics, or you're trying to think about, rather than this disposable consumer life where you just buy something, throw it out, buy something, throw it out, buy something, throw it out in an end, you can fix things. You can not create a massive landfill full of waste. You can value the material objects and treat them with respect and learn skills but I have to admit, I only, there's something Philip K. Dick wrote about this too. Philip K. Dick, in some of his novels, he wrote from the position of a guy who was like repairing all sorts of old radios after the apocalypse and stuff like this. And, like all the industry has been wiped out, but all we can do is salvage these things and try to get them to work again and stuff like this, right? And it's like, in contrast to, Aldous Huxley, The Brave New World, where it's like you are encouraged not to repair things because it's better for the economy just to keep buying. And every time you repair something that you don't buy, you're putting somebody out of a job. And you're more. So it questions this whole morality of GDP. Why is GDP your output a measure of being a virtue when your ability to mend and save and repair could be a measure of virtue? And there's this word salvation, to be saved, right? To save what is broken, to save what is going obsolete, to save what is headed to the landfill, to recover things, right? And this is perhaps the salvific quality. Okay, number of things here. The salvage punk, Saturn and Neptune, right? The salvific thing about Neptune versus just another piece of junk in the landfill, right? Just another thing you use once and forget it, right? Single-use plastics, right? All that shit, right? There's versus, I don't know, where am I even going with this? I think you get it, right? I think you see what I'm trying to say here. I have no idea how long I've been talking. I think I'll pause. I think I'll stop here. But I haven't been talking a lot about the astrology. I've been talking more about this book, Sad Planets. But this is mainly, the sad planet thing resonates with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, Saturn being sad. But there is with Neptune, a certain salvific narrative here, that there's certain things which seem like they're just headed to shit that could be saved, could be recovered, or even, and I think that even when it comes to things like the Dark Enlightenment, that even, there's something even redemptive about the fact that I don't agree with Nick Land about anything, but even at his own word, he's more optimistic than what people make the Dark Enlightenment out to be, right? Or people make the Dark Enlightenment out to be this completely cynical, nihilistic acceleration that goes beyond, and using this word transhumanism, and it's like this very narrow tunnel vision way where it's just a bunch of people who only watch Terminator 2, who can't imagine anything else, and it's like, and you feel like you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna veer off the well-trodden path and explore some new things, and then you get cringe is just par for course, perhaps, right? Sometimes you might stumble into unknown territory and set off a few landmines, but maybe it's worth it. Maybe it's a worthy risk to take for the sake of just not being so just stuck on this dumb, stupid, narrow-minded way of looking at things, right? And that there's something redemptive in that even the people who are kind of who we might say we're gonna go this way but not that way, the way that you're veering off from, there could be some redemptive thing, the thing that you're discarding in favor of some other direction. There could be something to redeem about it. And Saturn rules the opposition. Neptune, the salvific, redemptive quality. There you go. Another video for Saturn and Neptune. This is how I'm trying to weave this together. Hopefully, I don't know what you guys are going to make of this, but this is me trying to explain my philosophical bullshit. Thanks for watching.